Good afternoon. I'm Dr. Anthony Neal. I am Associate Professor of Philosophy at Mississippi State in the Department of Philosophy and Religion. And I'm also a faculty fellow in the Shackles Honors College. And I also serve as an affiliated faculty in the Program for African American Studies. I want to first thank my good friend Kevin here, who invited me to be with you. And I hope that something that I say will be salient and such that it will lead to some type of robust conversation afterwards. I'm going to speak from a book that I'm in a process of writing. I shouldn't say a book because I'm only 50 pages in, but we'll see how it goes. And the topic, of course, has been offered, mapping the movement. And there are a couple of ideas I need to talk about before I get into this concept of mapping the movement or the modern era of the African American freedom struggle. When I wrote my dissertation some years back, I came up with several concepts because there was one thing that kind of bothered me about doing African American studies. There were these kind of guesstimates that people made, but there were no real ways to tease out how to get at which writers you should read, which writers you shouldn't read, how did you group them together, things of that nature. And philosophy didn't seem to be really that concerned about all of these kinds of things. And since that this was something that I figured I was going to spend a lifetime of trying to wrestle with, I figured that I needed to try to come up with some ideas and some ways to approximate something that looked like a canon, even though canon, and to talk about canon is a bad word in philosophy. And so one of the concepts that I talk about is ethnic reflective canon. And then also a way to get into any type of idea, whether it's mathematical, scientific, whatever, you have to have some type of framework such that you know how these things hang together. And so there's this concept, perceptual framework that I deal with, the African American freedom aesthetic, and which I have called freedom gazing. I also have an article on that. And so I'll just start, and there'll be some skips and bumps in the middle, but we'll see how it goes. I won't read the whole thing to you and do that kind of damage to you. The focus of this ethnic reflective canon is twofold. First, it was the intent to expand the conception of the experience of Blackness over and against how it is described by others whose intent was to dehumanize through the dissemination of anti-Black racist notions. Secondly, there was the goal to advance a conception of the possible, grounded in the intense desire to experience freedom. One presupposition at work in the commitment to create this canon, which demonstrated the true depiction of being Black in the United States, was that in the aftermath of slavery, if they were to experience real freedom, they would need to become a community, a Black community. In order for this community to provide the best opportunity for a flourishing future for Black people, they had to have the opportunity to know themselves in their condition and to chart their future. In other words, the ethnic reflective canon did just as Du Bois estimated. And he talks about this a bit in The Apology, which is the first chapter in Dusk of Dawn. It exposed the strange, or the ethnic reflective canon exposed the strange meaning of Blackness in the 20th century in words. For if we were to reframe Du Bois's with a view towards gaining clarity about where the meaning of Blackness was buried, we could intuit that his statement could be expanded to announce the meaning of Blackness was buried in his written words. And this is in the forethought of the souls of Black folk. For it was in his written words that upon a deep study of them, if one parsed them correctly, the humanity of Black folk became fully exposed. However, the words of the white world in the description of Black people were many times violently oppressive. The violent and oppressive nature of these words was so pervasive that it was often told to Black school children upon encountering horrible descriptions of Black people in their required text to just ignore the descriptions and to search for deeper meanings. Quite frequently, the deeper meanings that were found many times were those of a damaged psyche and a sense of inferiority. County Cullen says something about this. He says, he wrote a poem called Incident. The poem goes, once riding in old Baltimore, heart filled, head filled with glee, I saw a Baltimorean keep looking straight at me. Now I was 8 and very small, and he was no whit bigger. And so I smiled, but he poked out his tongue and called me a nigger. I saw the whole of Baltimore from May until December. Of all the things that happened there, that's all that I remember. I'll say just a bit about, before I get into the mapping process, I'll say just a bit about the freedom gaze. The freedom gaze, or freedom gazing, is used here to describe a perceptual framework within African American culture during the modern era, stemming from the experience of the American oppressive moment. By perceptual framework, I simply mean a set of ideas or concepts people hold, which shape the way in which they view the world as such a fundamental level that it can be thought of as automatic. The freedom gaze, as a perceptual framework, can be further understood as having a perception that is framed by or filtered through the desire for freedom. In this sense, this nomenclature of freedom or freedom gaze can be thought of as having an explanative function, one that provides an understanding and a landing from which to begin critical analyses of critical works, philosophical thoughts, and possibly even active participation with certain pursuits. The freedom gaze, as a perceptual framework, refers to the confluence of time, space, and moment. Moment alone can be easily understood as being a synonym of time. However, it is necessary to make a distinction in order to provide greater texture or a more robust description, one which narrows the focus upon particular objects of description. By using a perceptual hermeneutic phenomenology as an epistemological framework to gain nearness towards a meaning of perceptual framework, such as the freedom gaze, moment is meant to operate similarly to Gadamer's conception of horizon, but closer to Whitehead's notion of actual occasion. In this sense, the past and the desired future must be accounted for along with the experience of the moment, which can be gleaned, if only partially, by parsing the person's understanding of themselves in the context of their experiential moment. Black ethnically reflective thinkers in the moment of the modern era took up certain themes and concerns which began to be replicated, forming a cadre. This cadre of ethnically reflective thinkers were also responsive to those within the cadre, whether in speeches, poetry, other works of literature, philosophical essays, and even in historical texts, demonstrating an awareness of canon formation. They sometimes agreed and sometimes they disagreed. They sometimes made adjustments, and at other times they used the frameworks, tropes, and analogies that were beginning to develop and extend the ongoing conversation with greater clarity. The point here is that within the moment of the modern era, freedom gazing, or the desire of these Black ethnically reflective thinkers for freedom as a perceptual framework, fundamentally shaped their thoughts, their writings, and in many cases, it shaped the activities in which they engage. This point is made clearer through the identification of the categorical thinking which surrounded the concepts of humanity, Blackness, and freedom. In a very real sense, the instability of these three concepts for Black people formed the fundamental grounding from which most of their reflections stemmed. Certainly, there are other thinkers who address some, if not all, of these categories, who were outside of this cadre and outside of those who were understood to be Black, according to the traditions which arose around the adjudication of Plessy versus Ferguson, which we know to be the one drop rule. But it was the aim of their reasoning and the respect for other Black members of the cadre, which separated the members of the cadre from those who were on the outside. For example, when W.E.B. Du Bois wrote about the strange meaning of Blackness at the dawning of the 20th century and asked the question, how does it feel to be a problem? It was certainly not a mere academic exercise. The knowledge that others could only view his skin as a problem was a very real existential crisis for him as well as the other Black boys of which he spoke. The same can be said of Howard Thurman's Jesus and the Disinherited. Not only did Thurman see Jesus as a member of the disinherited, but the crisis of which he wrote was that he and others like him in the modern era were likewise members of the disinherited. It was for this group in the modern era that he wrote the book. Many on the outside could consider themselves well educated without having ever read or heard any of these existential concerns by members of this cadre, or having heard or read one such member, felt themselves knowledgeable enough to offer solutions. These problems persist even to this day. Now to get more deeply into this idea of mapping the movement. And so looking at intellectual subjects as geographical terrain is not something new. It is not something that I made up. I want to give credit to those sociologists and others who have created this concept. And Lewis Gordon does a wonderful job of presenting this idea of shifting geographical terrain. So this is not an original concept. I think it's new in the way that in which I'm going to use it here. People, often when the idea of movement gets evoked, strict attention is not given to the possibility that different understandings might exist of this term. In the absence of giving the contours of movement strict attention, there is the possibility of a failure to capture certain nuances, which leads to a reduced possibility that the full intent of the word comes to the fore. On one extreme, there is the notion of movement, meaning motion or the change in the spatial relationship between two or more bodies. But on another extreme, there is the notion of movement, meaning the exchange of ideas or change in consciousness, conceptual frameworks, or worldviews. Somewhere in between, there is the migration of feelings, emotions, the phenomenon of being in the world, or what some have labeled as a type of exchange of the self during moments of becoming. The modern era of the African American freedom struggle was certainly a movement of the people, which many are in agreement concerning its existence. However, the acknowledgement of the movement is not exactly co-equal to its explanation. An explanation must involve a multi-level analysis when considered. It must be kept in tension with all of the factors thought to be causal, as well as the agency and the very understanding of humanity that must be bound to any notion of Black people in relation to their status as human beings during this moment. Some past depictions of the movement were put forward as descriptions that are totally in response to the oppressive behavior of whites. In this sense, Black people who participated in the freedom movement are not thought to have developed notions of community or even freedom that should be given any attention by today's scholars, because they are believed to lack complexity and to have purported only opposition. It is at this point I will put forth a novel understanding of freedom, one which I believe to be more useful in forming a conceptual frame from which to corral these discussions about freedom. With this conceptual framework, it will be possible to gain still further greater clarity about the dissonant features of the movement of Blacks toward freedom and the usefulness of this analog for making these features visible. Freedom is movement. Freedom is not struggle, although it may be a struggle to be free, i.e. move, but freedom and struggle are not equivalent. Freedom is simply movement. And wherever there is freedom of some kind, there is movement of some kind. When greater restrictions are placed upon movement of any kind, freedom is restricted to the same degree. When freedom is denied, movement is denied. The movement among Black people was about freedom and was the exercise of freedom. All attempts to curtail the movement were attempts to limit freedom. Therefore, to be a reactionary towards the attempts by others to gain their freedom is to be against movement, which is freedom. Conservative strategies to keep things as they are limit freedom or stand against movement. Freedom is movement. Mapping the movement, which this section is labeled, points to an attempt to acknowledge the correlation between the concept of movement and the temporal spatial reality of movement. Just as maps are used to determine location and spatial relationships at a given point in time, the idea of mapping the movement is meant to perform a similar function in terms of the movement. Also, just as maps use reference points to make determinations concerning the temporal spatial relationships, the predominating ideas mentioned in my last section, which you didn't hear, which are peace, rebellion, revolution, and freedom, will also be perform a similar function such that the movement can be better charted during the modern era. In order to find a location on the map, there are certain tools which one must be familiar. Of these tools, two seem to be most important. They are coordinates and scales. For the purpose of locating an individual in terms of the geography, I will use the following categories as coordinating tools: speeches and talks, and also activities or actions and writings. For the purpose of scalar quantities in terms of the coordinating categories, this analysis will use the individual's commitment to the concept in place of numerical value to measure their temporal spatial relationship to the notion of freedom. Now, I know it's hard to picture that. I think I have the ability to share my screen. So I think I'll try to do just that for just a moment. Let's see, desktop. That didn't work. But in any case, maybe I'll get a chance to do it in just a second. Let me say just a bit more. I think once I say just a bit more, it'll help out. Okay. The individual's commitment to freedom might well be verbalized and written about, but they may also subscribe to the notion of peace at all costs, right? So I want to put these in some type of tension, right? So here's this person that is talking about freedom, but on one hand, but they're talking about peace at all costs, okay? And so their subscription to peace will put them in a position of sacrificing freedom for the sake of peace. Therefore, the correlation between the desire for peace and their commitment to freedom produces a low position in terms of their movement participation, right? So you can take someone like Booker T. Washington, right? And his compromise, his Atlanta compromise. So here, no one could, justifiably give off the idea that Booker T. Washington was a person that didn't want freedom. I mean, his biography is called Uplifting the Race. Here's a guy that walked from Alabama to Virginia to accept a scholarship at Hampton University. But his idea of peace at all costs, so this idea of accommodationism, right, seems to sacrifice his ability to be free for his ability to have peace. All right. And no number is needed to represent this contradiction in their commitment. For example, in an attempt to quell the Los Angeles riots of the early 90s, police beating victim Rodney King asked a now famous or infamous question aimed at restoring the situational stasis or peace, which existed before many witnessed his beating. King asked, "Can't we all just get along?" The question, although applauded by many whites at the time, was received with disappointment and confusion by blacks. The riots themselves were thought to be an attempt to be heard on the way to a moment where justice could be restored. The uses of peace, rebellion, and freedom as it applies in this writing is put forward here and earlier for the purpose of establishing conceptual categories and frameworks through which Black thought about the Black experience might be analyzed. In this sense, Black thought about the Black experience, or Black people thinking about the existential nature of Blackness, is essentially philosophizing. In the performance of this reflective activity, certain common concepts have become standard notions or concepts for the comportment of Black consciousness in the face of the existential condition of Blackness. Four of these concepts, being peace, rebellion, revolution, and freedom, are presented here to not to encapsulate all categories of Black thought, but to demonstrate African American philosophy as a distinct mode of thinking and subject of which to study. This is what I take to be a point of which was presented by Lucius Outlaw in his proclamation of African American philosophy as being necessarily pragmatic in character while focusing on the existential conditions of Black people. To be sure, this type of thought or philosophizing can be separated into two modes or forms, one formal and the other informal. The purpose here is not to determine which is the more valid mode, but to demonstrate that Black people have systematically thought about the Black experience and have gone further to also think about how one should think about the Black experience. Certainly, I do not mean to propose that eventually writings or texts will be found on some plantation archaeological dig containing philosophical musings of formerly enslaved Africans. I simply mean that the activity known as philosophizing was not foreign to Black people, but it was not until the modern era that opportunities to put these thoughts on paper presented themselves in any significant measure. Peace, rebellion, and revolution and freedom serve as guideposts such that upon mapping the movement, the contours of such philosophizing might easily become, in the words of Charles Mills, Blackness visible. An early example approaching what is meant by the notion currently being put forward is demonstrated in the writings of Frederick Douglass in his oration delivered in Corinthian Hall, Rochester, July 5th, 1852. Douglass asked, what to the American slave is your 4th of July? The implication of the question assumes that at least some currently enslaved possessed at the time of the speech the ability to think about the meaning of this particular holiday for themselves. This essentially means that they thought about what thoughts they had on the matter. In other words, they thought of themselves thinking about the American special day, or it can be said that they philosophized. Evidence of this phenomenon is demonstrated by Douglass, who himself was a former slave. As Douglass resolved to throw light on the matter through the writing of this speech, methodologically, it was not necessary for him to appeal to phenomenological renderings of qualitative research provided by way of interviews with other former slaves. He knew firsthand how an enslaved person might feel, for he had once suffered the very fate. Except now he could place his thoughts into words. He was able to reflect on his own past thoughts on the matter. He was also able to make determinations about their meaning. In doing so, extrapolations as to what his thoughts implied could be made. Douglass states, to him, the American slave, your celebration is a sham. This statement was made immediately after asking what these celebrations meant to the American slave. He does not equivocate in using such a description. This description is a demonstration that in reflecting upon his thoughts as a slave, Frederick Douglass reflected upon the occurrence of these celebrations, observed their contradictions, and was able to make a determination about the meaning and value of the same. Also, in this thought process, or the philosophizing of Douglass, the recognition that the reflective act was catalytic in changing the slave in terms of how he came to understand the concept of American freedom, and his own feelings on the matter was evident. It exposed to Douglass that he could not consider the celebration to be about freedom while so many were still in bondage. Certainly, Frederick Douglass would count as a participant in the freedom movement, although outside of or before the modern era. And what's unique about the modern era, in 1896, you get the along with the adjudication of the Plessy versus Ferguson Act, you also get the first the publication of Du Bois's dissertation, which is the first publication of someone who is considered to be Black or African American to use their education for the study of Black people. All right. Certainly, Frederick Douglass, meaning he was conceptually outside of the bounds of the modern era and existed before the time frame and existential conditions which brought about the modern era. One other thing that's interesting about the Plessy versus Ferguson decision. So before the Plessy versus Ferguson decision, you could be a mulatto, you could be all types of groupings of people. But after the Plessy versus Ferguson decision, one could only, you were either white, in terms of African Americans, you were either white or you were Black. And it had nothing necessarily to do just with your skin color. For those of you that are interested, if you pull up a picture of Homer Plessy, you will clearly see that if he were to walk into a room today, by most people, he'd be accounted for as white. There was, before the adjudication, there was no national legal standard which separated his skin from others. That's Homer Plessy. But what is Douglass's relationship to the freedom movement? In other words, how can it be demonstrated through points of reference that Douglass, Alain Locke, and even Howard Thurman were in the same social movement without singularly referencing the obvious commonality of race, which in this sense becomes a weak reference tool? Narrowly speaking, a movement or the participants in a movement, and therefore the non-participants as well, can be classified in a relationship to the movement by their psychology or conscious thought concerning the movement, their activity or grassroots organizing with respect to the movement, or their humanistic expression created in support of the movement or spawned by the agenda of the movement. An example of this would be Angela Davis, Fannie Lou Hamer, and Elizabeth Catlett, each of whom were members of the freedom movement within the modern era. Angela Davis is recognized as a scholar whose writings demonstrate a revolutionary mindset or consciousness. Fannie Lou Hamer was recognized as a grassroots organizer and leader who helped found the Mississippi Freedom Party. Elizabeth Catlett, on the other hand, was a revolutionary artist who had her citizenship revoked for her activities as an artist. These three each represent one of the classifications, and the necessity of their placement within the movement can be also clearly demonstrated. The demonstration of the placement within the movement will be performed. I'm going to talk about that later, but I need to talk about and define these categories. However, before the mapping function can be fully explored, the predominating ideas of peace, rebellion, revolution, and freedom must be defined in terms of their intended use and their relevance indicated as pertains to this work. The defining of these terms is necessary because of the recognition that their regular usage is fraught with ambiguity and inaccuracies, leading to a relativistic and situational understandings. Am I okay on time, Kevin? Okay. Okay. These understandings allow individuals to think of them in terms of their own proclivity, right? So there are many different ways people think about freedom. And I want to kind of narrow that down, right? I will begin with peace and build towards the consistent conceptual framework in which to situate the other terms. And I think of this in terms of a type of continuum. Peace assumes the reasonable attainment of an acknowledged common good. Common good can be understood in this sense as an established, flourishing environment for the greater community. However, just as there is the concept of peace, there is also a negative or false notion of peace, which is understood to be only the absence of verbal and physical conflict. An understanding of this negative notion of peace is required in order to deconstruct or rupture an often used but terribly inadequate notion of the term. The inadequacy of this notion of peace stems from an assumption that certain things are held in common, such as a common effort towards the goal of peace, along with common or shared notions about what counts as a flourishing experience. Peace as an ideal obtains relevance within social context owing to its connection to the concept of the good or flourishing life. A life that flourishes in this context has no essential meaning, but must be kept in tension with concepts such as expansion, progress, growth, and fulfillment. These concepts are usually thought to be opposite to a fragile existence or a life full of disappointment. Conceptually, since the meaning that is provided here for peace is understood to be fundamentally communal, I have therefore provided a meaning for flourishing, which is also attached to community. So therefore, you can see where Booker T. Washington's accommodationalism would be low on the totem pole and also carry with it a false sense of peace because this idea of flourishing was not attached to it. Whereas peace should be understood as necessarily communal or an agreement between two or more, rebellion requires no such agreement. Rebellion as such occurs when the authority or majority no longer provides for the common good or no longer establishes a flourishing environment. Rebellion in this sense should be understood as an overt act of rejection by an individual or group of the predominant ideas or power structure which hinder the opportunities for flourishing by a group within the larger community or by an individual. Rebellion is demonstrated by simply saying no, or it can also be a complex plan maneuver to demonstrate disagreement. However, rebellion begins by freely thinking, particularly thinking which is in opposition to the authority or larger communal structure. Thus, rebellion is a process which begins in meaningful silence. Rebellion is also the first step in a social movement. By comparison, peace stops social movement or thwarts its beginning. Rebellion requires a social consciousness or some thought about the self in relationship to the power structure or larger group. It is plausible that peace does not carry the same requirement because thought about peace is less concerned with difference and more concerned with commonality. The more a person is committed to peace, their commitment to rebellion rises to the opposite degree. Therefore, even nonviolent struggle cannot be fully equated to peace because of its requirement to struggle. This is because struggle requires resistance in some fashion. Nonviolent struggle is also a type of rebellion. Peaceful resistance or peaceful struggle are both corrupted concepts or misleading propaganda with no clear and concise meaning. Resistance and struggle are both rebellious actions, and both are meant to disrupt peaceful states of existence. Therefore, rebellion tugs at the very fiber of peace. The references made to a peaceful rebellion must therefore be taken as referencing the tactics of the rebellion and not to the maintenance of the status quo. Revolution is often confused with rebellion, but unlike rebellion, revolution requires a shared decision to make change, after which action is taken. Revolution rises above mere resistance or the mere resistive act and is indicative of communal thinking and communal effort to bring about societal change in consciousness coupled with substantive structural changes. Revolutionaries do not seek only to resist the status quo. Revolutionaries desire to change the status quo. Also, because revolution requires the revolutionary go beyond mere rebellion by developing a change of consciousness or philosophical thinking and deep structural changes. It is therefore a higher or more intense form of rebellion. The revolutionary is compelled to not only consciously dissent, reject, or refuse, but the revolutionary must consider what the new beginning or way forward entails. This is the philosophical component. They must consider what constitutes the change they seek and what is only a reform of the status quo. The creation form or the substance of the revolution in some fundamental way must be incongruent with the previous instantiation of that society. And much of this is taken is taken from the ideas. It's certainly not word for word, but it's taken from the ideas of Theda Skocpol, who was a political scientist at Yale University. And she even questions whether what we call the American Revolution was a revolution at all. Well, but that's a whole nother discussion, and you can ask me about that during the question and answer session. If this is not true, can we really think that a revolution has occurred? Who gets to decide? It must be the revolutionary, of course. The answer to the question has much to do with the true form of peace mentioned earlier. First, it was established that peace assumes the reasonable attainment of an acknowledged common good. Next, peace was established to be necessarily communal or an agreement between two or more. Revolutionaries engage in the revolutionary act because they cannot flourish or positively develop, which stifles their humanity. The right to develop is a fundamental human right that lies at the intersection of the entire gamut of economic, social, cultural, political, and civil rights. That's a quote from Wilfred David. To develop is basic to all biological life, but for humans, development, at least on some level, requires agency. Agency requires freedom. Accordingly, revolution is thus the assertion of agency where freedom has been denied. Therefore, the peace that the revolutionary desires is commensurate with freedom. I think I'll stop there and see if we have some questions. Let me pull up my chat.
Thank you so much, Anthony. You'll see in the chat, we were just talking about things like, were you able to share your screen? And so, yeah, our apologies for setting that a bit late. In any case, thank you so much for that, Anthony. Is very profound. You certainly have more than enough material for a book in here. So, and I really look forward to some future opportunities to talking about it with you. In the meantime, we have some people here on the Zoom with us, so I'm going to concede questions. I, of course, have many questions myself, but I'm going to concede questions to the audience here. If you would like to ask Anthony Neal here a question, please raise your hand, or I think there may be few enough that you could just interject and it wouldn't be too chaotic, but I prefer a hand raise if you have it. Let's get back to this American Revolution thing here. I'll just begin. So explain what the context here. What makes it not a revolution? I love the idea, but I want to hear your elaboration of it, or your. Yeah, go.
Yeah. So according to, I took a class called The Philosophy of Revolution when I was in graduate school, and so the professor, of course, was a Marxist philosopher and political theorist, but I don't think that weighed in necessarily on his answer, and also because Theda Skocpol, who he gleans the answer from, is not a Marxist. What she says is this: she gives about 10 categories. I'm only going to give you a few, but she says, so you have to have, in order to have a true revolution, you have to have a change, first of all, in the class and grouping of the people who were in leadership. So that would be number one. Number two, you'd have to have a change in the basic ideas, myths, and belief structure after the revolution that you had before the revolution. So it seems that just those two alone disqualified. You do have some type of rebellion, things of that nature, but you seem to have the same class structure. You seem to have the same belief system. In some ways, you seem to have the same grouping of people. Now, of course, someone can make the case. No. You have at one time you had the British. You had no, but that's going to be hard to make that case.
Yeah. So it's really interesting that you say this, and I didn't mean to just raise a conceptual point about revolutions, although I'd be interested enough in that because it could apply to so many contexts. But let's just stick with the context of American history. One of the big controversies in the past year, and in the scholarship, it was very profound, right? The reaction to the 1619 Project. I don't know if you followed any of this in American historiography, but there were some wonderful, wonderful analyses being written in opposition to the 1619 Project. And I was very immersed in this for a little bit. And then, of course, Trump and his cronies come out with the 1776 Project, right? So we get this argument over the founding of America. You know, how do you see your theory here about what the freedom movement is to bear on that question, right? Like,
so you seem to get, and you have to be careful in public spaces. Or nowadays you get death threats. But anyway,
I'm sorry to laugh at that. It's not funny. I mean, we know friends of ours who have had death threats because of things that they said in harmless contexts like these, like scholarly contexts. And the next thing you know, yes, but
to the question, you have this idea of so here you have, on one hand, you have one group who are engaged in a type of totalitarianism.
Yeah.
Right. And you seem to have another group who
I lost you, Anthony. I don't know.
Right? So they may not be equally in that sense, right? Wealthy landowners, hugely. Did I freeze there for a second? Sorry about that.
Yeah, I don't know if it was you who froze, but my screen froze. Anyway, keep going.
But we're huge, large landowners and rich, very wealthy, and they also wanted the opportunity for a certain type of totalitarianism, right? Or we could say exploitation, right? And what happens? One of the things that we seem to forget is that on top, above anything else, when we understand African American slavery or African slavery as it existed in the American context, they were exploited workers. So you just have one group of people oppressing, and you remove that group and put another group, which is for the most part the same grouping of people. They just are breaking away, right? And so in some ways, in order to talk about revolution, you could talk about the Haitian Revolution, right? Where you get a different class structure of people, different beliefs, ideal system. Same thing with the Cuban Revolution, a different grouping of people.
I see. So the Haitian Revolution is of course an important event, not only for Haiti and for the Caribbean, but for American Blacks, right? So does this factor into how you're thinking about this subject?
Yes, right. Because in some ways you can clearly see that Haiti, the ideas that developed out after Haiti or during the Haitian Rebellion are incongruent with in the American context and also the French context. And they're also, is one of the results that's little talked of is this idea of you get the Louisiana Purchase as a result of. Right. And Haiti is looked upon as being a threat to Western culture. Right. So much so that they're made to pay reparations right into the 20s. They don't finish paying this monies until the 1920s or 30s, I think. Yeah.
So let's talk about the notion of progress, because there are several types of progress that you seem to be hinting at. On the one hand, your four concepts according to which you want to map the movement are a progressive relation among those, and that's something that I couldn't get from the abstract. Right, this caught me by surprise, and it's brilliant. I love how you analyze these concepts and relate them to one another. Peace, rebellion, revolution, the relationship among these. But it makes a movement one about progress. And so what we're getting here from your ideas about revolution, and maybe we should look at the American Revolution as not really a revolution. Maybe we look at the founding of America in 1619. I know you're not saying all these things, but we're latching on to these elements of the discourse. And that's a narrative of continuity that tells us that there hasn't been progress in any meaningful sense, that too little has changed. There hasn't been a clear before and after, but the movement, as you express it, is one of a before and after. It is one of progress. So how does this play into your image of the history?
Well, so in one sense, yes, there has been progress, but the reason I stop and I talk about this idea, I stop it at like 1975. I'm, and the year, I always tell people that the year in some way is arbitrary. You need to see it as a period, right? So it could be it's 72, the ending of the Black Panther Party, effectually. You can talk about 75, ending of Vietnam, 78, the Baki case. Or 1980, and I've really been pushed towards using 78. You may see a footnote in my book, and I adjusted to 78, right? But 1980 is the election of Ronald Reagan, right? In that period, one of the things that gets exchanged is the idea of a true type of freedom for representational democracy and upward mobility through capitalism. Right. It's not to say that, any notion of those things would not have worked along with freedom, but the idea or the concept for freedom gets displaced. Right. So this idea of, if I gain more wealth, more money, then now I have freedom. Right. Such that you can get the concepts of the Jay-Z's, the Beyoncé's, and things of that nature. Right.
Yes.
I am now wealthy.
Yes.
Right. Look at me. I'm free because I'm wealthy. Right.
Yes.
Whereas during the modern era, there was a clear notion of, we need deep structural changes within the government. We need deep structural changes within a whole constellation of things. Whereas this is why you get authors like Adolph Reed, who was talking about the stirrings in the jug, looking back at that particular moment of what I call the modern era, and see what ideas were worth recapturing and what ideas we lost. And there's a good part in the movie, Raisin in the Sun. It's a moment in the movie Raisin in the Sun where he's talking to his mom, and he's really upset because he's lost all his money, right? And the mother tells him, son, it was never about money. It was about freedom. And I think that that's something that after the modern era, we tend to lose that notion.
Wow. That's really profound, and it brings in, it brings in some possible criticisms of pop culture that you touched upon. I'm going to push that off for half a second, though, and ask you about beginnings, right? Because you're dealing at this very abstract conceptual level, and I love that. And you're talking about freedom as movement. We have a comment here from Braxton Williams. He says, I love that. Rodney Wilson, by the way, says, Dr. Neal, your thoughts on the revolution are very enlightening. So we have some appreciation of the things you're saying here. But movements have beginnings. Yeah. And really, movements have beginnings and endings, and hopefully, like, movements make progress, right? That's why, like, I don't want to push a notion of progress, but I want to just kind of put it in that universe. Now let's get back to this beginning, right? Especially since you tell us that the end is ambiguous, right? But there is an end, there is a change for you. You begin us with 1896, and it's an interesting thing, I think, about American history, that the more significant, the more significant events, like the times when there was a big change, are not what they seem. They are 1896, they're 1877. They're not 1861 or 1865, or maybe even 1776, right? And this is so it's not as if things have always been the same in American history. They've not been the same, right? 1877 is a real moment, right? Things change at that moment. A different group comes into power, So talk a little bit about that. How did you arrive at the idea of starting here with 1896? What are some of the things that you take into consideration?
Okay, so you bring up a good point with the 1877, the Hayes-Tilden Act. You get this this way of ending whatever could be called Reconstruction, right? But there's still this notion that that there is this possibility for at least a certain class of Black people to succeed, right? In fact, Du Bois even talks about during this particular period, many Black people, including himself, were thinking about going back to Africa. And he says he changed his mind because he realized they were allowing the educated class to go to Africa. And what was going to end up happening was the uneducated class was going to end up being a servant population, right? But in 1896, that seems to all change.
Yeah.
Right? You get a clear defining of the color line, right? There's no graduation in there. Louisiana, which can be an interesting place in terms of how we understand race and things of that nature, even they have to fall in line. Homer Plessy is from Louisiana. On his birth certificate, it said Creole. Well, guess what? The Supreme Court said, no, you Black, right? Yeah. African American, Negro, right? All of these kinds of terms. And you get these Black codes that go across the nation, right? So this becomes adjudicated into that Blackness becomes so pervasive into everything that you do, from where you use the bathroom to whom you can sleep with.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Wow. So yeah, that's very profound. So with the defining of the color line comes the defining of a movement that you can talk about, or at least the possibility of a movement, right? And one of the things I loved about what you said is, early on in the talk, you put into question the idea of the unity of a movement, right? Like, what do these different people, what does Anthony Neal have to do with Frederick Douglass? How can we tie these things like into some unified picture such that there's a movement, which has Frederick Douglass somewhere early on and Anthony Neal, somewhat late on, let's hope. So talk to me a little bit about this. Like, what does it mean to be Black in America, such that like this is something that we can define? Is this given to us by 1896, or does it stretch back further than that?
It's given. Yes, but the reason it's given to you, or the way in which it's given to you, is not just about, it's not just about color.
Yeah.
What happens there is this. You have so we know how philosophy goes, right? And I would say that this is probably something that happens across all disciplines. You could graduate today and be considered well educated, having never read anything about Frederick Douglass.
Oh, yeah. Oh,
right. Yeah. And you may have heard his name, but you don't have to read him. You don't have to even read King. You could have heard his speech, and that's it. You could graduate from school today having never even heard of Howard Thurman, right? Never read any deep thing past the first chapter of Du Bois's The Souls of Black Folk. You don't have to know anybody else off that litmus, right? So that's about 5 thinkers that most people who are not cognizant of this particular type of movement are aware of, right? They get about 5 names and that's it. And so what I'm trying to show is that these people were not only were they well aware of white thinkers at that particular time, but they're responding to each other, right? Yeah. So much so that you can see the lines that they lift from each other, right? Yes. And they're disagreeing, right? And one of the best things you can do is to disagree with someone in writing, right? And some of the same thing happens today, right? We can start looking in terms of philosophy, our discipline. We can look at those people who we take to be, foremost in the field, and we can look and see who's reading them and then who's actually citing them, right? So there are some that have written some really wonderful stuff, and people glance at it, but they don't cite it.
Yeah.
Right. Well, these people were one of the things that creates this movement, this canon. It's amazing to see Du Bois in the places he's located and the people he's interacting with, right? And the same thing with Alain Locke, and all of the people he's interacting with, all of the people, all of the things that he takes to be a part of, fundamentally a part of what's necessary to uplift Black people, right? And this goes beyond just color. These are the people who are legally put behind this line.
Yeah.
Right. And that's the difference.
Yeah. So and this is why I think you're illustrating very well. This is why something like an ethnic reflective canon is almost necessary for a movement, right? Without people referring to each other, you never get the unity needed to count as a movement. Um, I want to transition back to this pop culture thing. We have a question here from Braxton Williams, a brilliant former student of mine at Ball State University, who now has his own YouTube channel, and yeah, he's wonderful and doing wonderful thing. He writes, in a sense, wealth money does allow freedom or movement within social circles and structures. But what does movement look like outside of the monetary system that's ingrained in our social structure?
Okay, so certainly I would say that I want to be careful. I don't want to say that a person like Jay-Z does not have a certain type of freedom.
Yeah.
I'm saying that the goal for everyone to be a Jay-Z, first of all, is a goal that's probably improbable within a system like capitalism, right? Yeah. Which means that there are some other things that deep structural changes that you would need if you're going to maintain that system in order to have something that's substantive that can be accounted for as freedom, right? One thing you would need is land, right? So you don't need $1 billion to have land, right? So if you just think in terms of ownership, right? So if one of the things, a friend of mine asked me something like this, and I limited freedom to 3 things, right? Freedom would be control of your time, right? So in that sense, right? So if you have control of your time, so when I talk about in terms of movement, this is a movement of consciousness. Freedom could be understood as being control of your own time, ownership of your property, and some source of income that you are not worried so much day to day, right? See, he says, period. LL, control my own time. Yes. Yeah. So that becomes a necessary thing, right? So you think about people who might say, well, I'm making all this money, or how we say in pop culture, I'm making my ends, right? I'm getting all this money. Yeah, but how much time do you control? How much of your time do you control? All right.
Yeah. So okay, so I just want to push back a little bit on this 1980 business here, because we live in a very interesting time right now. I mean, we have Black Lives Matter. We've had all the events of 2020 and now 2021. And one of the things we learned is the deep continuity, right? This is why the 1619 Project is coming out now. You and I were kids in the same era, and I don't think we, well, maybe you could have, but I as a white kid couldn't have conceived of it then, right? Like that would have made no sense to me whatsoever. We got to a different place culturally where this makes sense. Now we get the references. Like I say 1877, I don't even need to explain to people anymore what that means. Everybody knows. A few years ago, I would have had to, follow that up with an explanation. Now people know this, and it's even referenced by our Congress as a precedent, right? Like this is one of the things that we saw when it came to this election business. They said, oh no, there's precedents for overturning an election, 1877. And I'm thinking, what is this the precedent you want, right? But in any case, this showed, that whatever movement existed in 1897, right, like it's still going and not really getting that far, right? Doesn't it? Like so don't you see like the events of the past 6-7 years as making for more continuity with the movement, with Black history?
All right, so it's tough, right? So there's some nuances and some tension there that we have to bring out, right?
Yeah.
In one sense, yeah, there is some continuity, right? But in another sense, and this is one of the things that and I really like the writings of Adolph Reed. We did our doctorates at the same school, of course, not at the same time. He's a bit older than I am.
He's a good bit older than you are.
Right, yeah. Right. But one of the things he talks about is the Jesse Jackson factor, right?
Yeah, right.
He has a book called that, and there's this moment where during the modern era, right, when Blacks were legally segregated, they did not depend on necessarily all of their answers would come from representative democracy, right?
Yes.
And so there's a way in which by the 70s, right, that with income levels, the housing act, Fair Housing Act, being able to go to majority institutions of learning, all of those kinds of things brings about a certain belief that electoral politics is the game changer, right?
Yes.
We could just get elected into office. Well, there's some problems with that. We start seeing things like you know uh, affectionately people say, Clinton is the first black president, right? But then he's doing these prison reforms where we get these mass incarcerations and all of these kinds of things, right? You start getting, you have things like gerrymandering, right? Where you just limit the ability of people to vote, right? All of these kinds of things that come about. You get the welfare reform, right? And all of these things might seem like good ideas, but you get these kinds of restrictions. But at the same time, people gave up a notion that grassroots movement was not something that facilitates politics, but it was supposed to be an end in itself, right? That grassroots movement must be maintained. You needed somebody who could speak truth to power, and we seem to have given up on that concept.
I see. Yeah, right. So, do you see a lot of the movement that is out there today then as too rooted towards electoral politics?
Yeah. Well, I definitely don't want to critique it. I think, I mean, in a total negative way. But you look at some of the people in Black Lives Matter, and what are they doing? They're getting elected to public office. Well, my question would be, what's the critique of representative democracy?
Yeah.
Right. And I haven't heard that critique of maybe there's some things that it just can't give us. Right.
Yes.
And so we haven't really fleshed that out. And one of the reasons we haven't fleshed that out is because there's not that deep dive looking back into the writings of the modern era, right? And looking at what were those things that they did that actually worked. We can easily talk about the failures. What are the things that they had that actually worked, right?
Wow. Okay. So I want to end with a question. So there are a lot of moments in your talk that I really loved, Anthony, and there are things that I'm going to take with me. But the moment that I loved the most was when you talked about Frederick Douglass and what does the 4th of July mean to your slave. And although I was familiar with that, and I thought I understood it, so to speak, right? It's like you made it palpable in a way that I hadn't really considered it before. And one of the things that you made palpable for me is the overriding importance of appreciating and uncovering the thoughts of others, right? And the thoughts of the people in the past. And that's a thing that I will take with me from this talk. So what I want from you is to give a few recommendations to the audience. What is it that we don't know from the past? Concrete things from the past. Like, who is it that we don't know that we ought to know?
Oh man, wonderful! It's interesting, when these kinds of questions come up, I immediately go blank.
No, that's okay. That's okay.
But I will say this.
Yeah.
I would say that. So of course, John McClendon and Stephen Ferguson's book, African American Philosophers and Philosophy. So that should be a standard. Right? Because one of the things it does is it goes back and talks about people like Thomas Nelson Baker, the first Black to get a PhD in philosophy at Yale, right? And I was in a conversation with Dr. Mickens, who's a physicist at Clark Atlanta. And one of the things he says is that we should have followed not Thomas Nelson Baker, we should have followed Dr. Edward Boucher, the first Black to get a PhD. And he got his PhD in physics, right? Who was a Booker T. Washington guy, right? And he says, if we had followed the science guy, and not the philosopher, we would be in better shape. Now, I totally disagree with him, but I'm just saying that those are the kinds of things that were happening, right? You have Eugene C. Holmes, right? Which is one of the reasons we don't know a lot of these philosophers. He was the chair of philosophy at Howard University after Alain Locke. And the reason we don't know about him is, and many others, is because he was a Marxist, right? And so when America went through this Marxist era, typically a lot of black people, now he really legitimately was a Marxist, but a lot of black ideas were considered to be Marxist ideas,
Right.
right? So you get people like even William Monroe Trotter, who gets arrested, put in jail. This is someone who, even though Du Bois disagreed with, he didn't want him to be in jail. He thought that this guy was in jail for ideas.
Yes.
Right? He ran a newspaper, right?
Yeah.
So many times we lose those kinds of names that are just gone, right? Just tossed to the dustbin of history.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Anthony. We're going to need to close, but this has been a really enlightening hour for me by the reactions I'm reading here in the comments. The same can be said for the other people who joined us. I really look forward to speaking with you again. And I just want to give one final message for those of you who are still paying attention to us. Big Questions, Big Ideas will be back on April 23rd for a special presentation by Krista Hodap of the University of Massachusetts at Lowell. She will be telling us about the masculine double bind. So I very much look forward to that, and I hope some of you join us then. One final round of applause, or virtual round of applause, for Professor Anthony Neal of Mississippi State University. Thank you, Anthony.
Take care.
All right.